Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I'm very honored to be here and to be opening the festival. I'm going to talk to you about the power of poetry. I discovered poetry as a child at a very difficult time in my life, which is a time when a lot of people discover poetry for the first time. I was 8 years old and I was sent to boarding school with that strange British habit of sending a child to the other side of a country to a place where no one loves them. And as a result of that rather traumatic experience, I was lonely, I was small, I was short of friends. I managed to discover one thing I was supposedly good at in this school, and that was reading poems aloud. And poetry became my friend. And as I grew older, I used to read it more and more, until one day in my early 20s, I was in London about to cross a big road, and as the lights turned, the man standing next to me walked into the road, and a car jumped the lights and hit him. And at that stage in my life, it was the most traumatic experience, apart from going to boarding school, I'd ever been through. This poor man was hurled in the air. I can still hear it as well as see it today. And he hit the ground, and somebody else in the crowd who worked in a hospital ran to help him and grab me. And between us, we managed to get his pulse to work again. And an ambulance came, and the police arrived and took our statements. And amazingly, this man went off in the ambulance, and I was standing back at the traffic lights where this drama had begun. The traffic was flowing, the police had gone, and the only evidence I had of this traumatic experience was that I had blood on my hands. But I had learnt a poem. There's a great British poet called Philip Larkin, and many years ago he wrote a poem called Ambulances. And this poem is all about how we feel when we see an ambulance on our street and it's taking away our next door neighbor, probably for the last time. And this poem talks about how we feel. Poor soul, we whisper at our own distress, because we sense the solving emptiness that lies just under everything we do, and for a moment get it whole, so permanent and blank and true. And those lines in my head and the rather large gin and tonic I bought in a bar managed to help me cope and deal with what I'd just been through. And I realize in hindsight, I was, to use the modern term, self-medicating with poetry. Years go by, I start a publishing company, and I then decide to start a poetry prize. And I started a thing called the Forward Prize, which now is nearly 30 years old, which is the biggest prize in Britain for poetry. And I make an anthology, a book every year called the Forward Book of Poetry, which is a kind of top of the pops of the best of poetry every year. After a few years, I realized we needed something a bit more public, so I started a thing called National Poetry Day, which is an annual celebration in the UK of poetry. In schools, bookshops, all over the country, people climb down buildings reciting poetry. It's an excuse to be poetic. But although I managed to get somewhere in getting poetry a little bit better known and making Poetry Corner a little larger, it still, to me, was a bit of a minority sport. In the UK, poetry is still a slim, volumed, elite, dusty, back of a bookshop thing, which most people are a little intimidated by. And then one day, the year we had the Olympics in London, I was asked to make a book of poetry, or choose my favorite poems for a big publisher in the UK. And in the way that you do when you have a book, I went on tour with it. And a friend of mine rang me up and she said, I'm organizing a festival, a literary festival, in Cornwall, in the west of England. And she said, you're always sending me poems to help me. When my father died, when I got divorced, and I want you, when you come down to this festival, to talk about poetry, but then I'm going to put you in a tent with a psychiatrist's couch, an armchair, and a prescription pad. And I want you to bring copies of every poem you can that you think might help people. And I'm going to allow them to book 15 minutes to come and tell you their worries. So I thought, this seems like a lovely idea. I'll try it for an hour. 6 hours later, with a very full bladder, I popped my head out of the tent, and there was still a long queue of people waiting to see me. And I realized that my friend Jenny had come up with the idea that really made it easy for people to access poetry. A week later, I got a telephone call from the BBC. They'd heard about this and asked if I'd do it on the radio. It was one of those magazine programs on a Saturday morning, and astonishingly, as I started to give examples of some of the poetry prescriptions that I provided, the producer said, "We've never had so many emails." And so they asked me back for the week before Christmas to give some prescriptions of poems you might need to help you with your relatives. As we know, Christmas can sometimes be a little more stressful than planned. I got through a few more months of this, and then bizarrely, because I'm a publisher in the UK, the British government asked me if I would conduct a review of the future of the public library network. And not wanting to be a government inspector, in every library, I offered to do a poetry pharmacy. And over 18 months, I listened to over 1,000 people's problems, just one to one. And it was the most humbling and extraordinary experience of my life. I realized that whether people were rich or poor, small or large, old or young, we all suffer from exactly the same problems. Probably the most significant problem of the lot is loneliness. I think it's been made worse by the telephone and the internet and all these things. Extraordinarily, we live in a time when we can communicate with each other in more ways and from more platforms than ever before, and yet in some ways we've never been more isolated. How often have you seen two people sitting side by side on their phones, communicating with people the other side of the world, but not to each other, even though they're only inches apart, and sometimes in the same bed? I found 2 lines of poetry written 700 years ago by the wonderful Persian poet Hafiz, which is my poetry prescription or antidote for loneliness. I wish I could show you, when you're lonely or in darkness, the astonishing light of your own being. Very simple, very short. But I would give it to people, I would print it out, I would say, stick it on your mirror, learn it off by heart. And one day I got an email from a woman saying, "Thank you so much, you won't remember me, but when you came to Liverpool to talk to people in the mental health unit, I was one of your patients. And last night I came home and some robbers had been to my apartment and destroyed almost everything. The only thing that had not moved," she said, "were those 2 lines of poetry stuck on my mirror. Thank you," she said. "It got me through the night." Just as movingly for me, last year I was doing a pharmacy, as I call it, in London, in an office building that was opening. And I was listening to people who work in the building's problems and finding poems for them. And halfway through, the security guard came. And he said, "I'm really sorry." He said, "Your 3:30's cancelled. Can I take their place?" I said, "Of course, come and sit down. What's on your mind?" He said, "I'm 31. I came out when I was 24, but I still have not had a relationship yet." And I said, "That's very, very sad. What do you put this down to?" He said, "I think it's because I'm Muslim and I'm gay, but I don't believe I can be both." I said, this famous poet, the man I've just mentioned, Hafiz, the greatest Sufi mystic poet of all time, at the core of the Islamic faith, 700 years ago wrote, "It happens all the time in heaven, and one day it will happen again on earth, that men and women who are married, and men who are lovers, and women who give each other light, will get down on bended knee and turn to their loved one with tears in their eyes and say, "How can I be more loving to you? How can I be more kind?" And the security guard got out of his chair, tears streaming down his face, gave me a big hug, and now he is dating. The wonderful power of poetry. So I think what's so intriguing to me, as increasingly people become more secular, less and less religious, it's almost as though the canon of poetry has become the secular liturgy. It's what we're using to share our thoughts, our concerns, our spiritual wonderment in the world with each other. In that sense, the telephone, the Instagram, all these kinds of things are a wonderful mediator of poetry. But what it means now is that we're beginning to embrace words as a way of finding solace because we no longer go to those places to read the words together. And that to me is really intriguing. In the UK, where I come from, poetry sales are up 50% in 3 years. This to me is all about this wonderful new trend. I'm going to leave you with one more little poetic thought. I know that as well as loneliness, probably one of the biggest worries that we all have is about our own courage, our own strength to do the things that perhaps we most want to do. Endlessly people come and see me when they tell me their problems and they say, "I wish I could start a relationship, end a relationship, write a book, paint a painting, do something exciting, but I don't have the courage." And there is a wonderful little poem written by a Frenchman called Apollinaire, adapted by an Englishman only 15, 20 years ago, and it's called "Come to the Edge." Come to the edge. It's too high. Come to the edge. I'm too scared. Come to the edge. And they came, and they pushed, and they flew. Thank you very much.